All right. Welcome back to Luke and Gabe's weekly podcast. This is episode one of one. And this
Welcome,
week,
welcome back. Yeah,
well,
nothing
well,
wrong with that, man.
welcome back to our first episode. All right. So, today in our podcast, we're going to be talking about influence. We're going to be talking about specific influencers and just how specific individuals have influenced a society, how they've done it, um, and what the effect has been over long term, even short and even short term. So, if you'd like to kick it off, Gabe, what are some things that have influenced you, and what are your thoughts on this topic?
So, I think on the topic of influencers, you can't really point to specific people always. It's always their ideals and maybe their accomplishments, maybe not just the persons themselves, because we can never really see what a person is just for their specific personality traits. We normally have to point at what they've done in their careers. A lot of big influencers in the world have always been, breakthroughs and people who weren't afraid to step on some lines, open up, the greater world to, bigger ideas. I mean, you could point at a lot of people, for business. You could point at Walt Disney. You can obviously always point at our founding fathers,
Yeah,
but you also got to look at some religious, belief systems. I mean, those are probably the biggest influencers in the world still today. Of course, some can argue that religion has really, taken a step back as, our technology and a lot of different people have, evolved over the years. But there's a lot of faith in a lot of different, you know,
yeah.
religions out
Well,
there.
I completely agree with you on that. One interesting thing you said that I want to go back to is that sometimes these people cross some lines, break some boundaries, go against the you know cultural norm. Just um, is there anyone that comes to mind when you think about someone that went against the cultural norm, did something that was just kind of out there, despite like getting public backlash for their time, they kind of just changed the way we think about a
You
specific
know,
topic, or
I think one of the major influencers that a lot of people don't realize, especially in a little bit of a smaller niche community, is going to be George Carlin. One of the greatest comedians of all time. He really took a different step in his way of approach to comedy. He wasn't going to sit back and use your mom and pop way of speech to just kind of influence
what was something
everyone
he
who
did
listened to
different?
him.
Like, how was
I
his
think he
comedy
was a
different?
lot more. He was a lot more in your face. He talked a lot about topics that nobody wanted to touch on. A lot of politics, a lot of even sex doesn't matter. All the cultural norms that people didn't really want to touch because they thought it was overbearing. Might hurt their career. George Carlin was very very smart, and he had a great approach to his comedy that a lot of comedians at the time just wouldn't even try to touch really based on topics.
So I'm kind of unfamiliar with this comedian. Like around what time was he doing comedy, or is he still doing comedy to this day?
George Carlin, he was a lot more prominent before the 2000s. All through the 70s, 80s, 90s. I believe it was his prime. But he was always an older comedian, and he influenced a lot of the greater comedians that we do have today. Um, a lot of the younger guys can point to his comedy, such as Bo Burnham is one, for instance. But he's definitely gone down as one of the greatest comedians of all time, just because he wasn't afraid to put his put his words out there and
Yeah,
talk about what he wanted to.
yeah, it's really interesting. I guess stand-up comedy isn't a genre I'm too familiar with, but would you say like for his genre, do you think he's changed the way a lot of people now would interact with that or like approach it in a different way?
Oh, for sure. I think a lot of the stand-up comedians today are,
Like
based
seek
solely off.
inspiration?
Oh, for sure. They love the inspiration. I mean, he wasn't afraid to call people stupid. He didn't. I mean, one of his greatest quotes of all time. You know, you just think about how stupid the average person is, and realize half of them are stupider than that. You know, he wasn't afraid to hurt some feelings because it was all anything that he could talk about, he talked about.
I have a lot of respect for that, to be honest. I feel like a lot of people, you know, I guess you don't hear about them too much because they end up not influencing that many people. You only hear about the people that go against like the cultural norms and they kind of like break the social standard. Um, that's like you hear about a lot, but um, I think it's should be really appreciated when someone actually does take a stance that's kind of out there and does something new and original. Um, so for my essay that I did for this class, I talked about influential people, and I made a collage which you can't see because you're not recording with me. You're in New York, but the collage on my screen has pictures of influential people who have changed, you know, the past and basically have rewritten the future. And some of the figures, like you said earlier, one of them includes Jesus Christ, who was a religious figure. And but one thing that they all have in common, if you think about it, every single person that I have researched and also have included on this collage has done something that wasn't traditional, and I think it's interesting to look at how they all have that same trait. They all have that same, what's the word? They all have that same like thing about them. You know what I mean?
They're all unique, really. You don't see successors, carry on one person's. You don't talk about them. It's always about being first.
Yeah, that's true. Um,
Uh,
what
I
were you gonna
think
say?
what we can't forget is that a lot of these influencers that we think of, Jesus Christ, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, we think about all the really good positive influencers, but you also got to remember there's a lot of really bad influencers. I mean, you could point to them. I mean, you could point in the Holocaust, with Adolf Hitler. You can point with a lot of different names on the list that were huge influencers. However, they just, didn't influence people the right way. They really rubbed shoulders and did a lot of bad things with their influence that they had over people.
Yeah, I guess that's a really important thing to, take into consideration. Just because you influence somebody or you influence a culture or society, that doesn't always mean it's for the best or for the better. Um, like you said, Adolf Hitler, um, obviously his impact on society was a very negative one, but technically he still was an influencer and he still changed the world forever. And I guess it's kind of important to keep that in mind when you are thinking about influencers and how it's not always a positive thing. Um,
What
s
I guess what you can take from a lot of those terrible influencers, a lot of the the worst people you could think of is that a lot of the time, when I think one of our strongest abilities as human beings is that, once we're up against opposition and, evil, we always, try to make the most positive, strong comeback. And I think a lot of people have come together as a community a lot stronger once, these bad catastrophic events happen. I mean, a lot of, a lot of influences we take are sometimes not even from humans at all. It's sometimes, just inclement weather, a lot of bad United States all over the world that, we come together and help to try to, fight against these, bad things that happen. And I mean, when you look at it, everyone wants to influence people positively if they can. I mean, you could see thousands upon thousands of people helping out, especially with the hurricanes. I mean, even up here with our blizzards, we always have great neighbors who come around and it's all the influence that the bad weather spreads. We always come together and try to make a positive out of it.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really interesting thing that you bring up. Another one of the classes I have during the semester is American history, and one of the events that we were talking about recently was the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and obviously it was a very horrific scene. You know, it was a very, very, very tragic moment in American history, well, world history to say the least. But one of the effects that came from it was it created a new surge in patriotism in the country. It created a new surge of unity. We often think of the United States as a pretty divided country, but sometimes even an extremely negative event like that can bring us closer together and bring us closer to having a common goal and having common grounds with each other. So it's it's interesting to think about how a negative a negative event can have positive effects afterwards, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I understand completely, and I think especially when we look a lot of influences over the ages. I mean, we find that you know what we take from it now maybe was not what it was intended to be, years ago. I guess one of the greatest, examples of one of this is probably the influence, on American culture that, Christopher Columbus has had. Uh, for hundreds of years, in the school system, we've, been taught that Christopher Columbus, we have a national holiday just about celebrating how we,
Yeah.
discovered. In reality, he slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, brought a bunch of disease over. I mean,
Well,
we've definitely taken a lot of influence from the wrong places, but try to make a positive spin off of it.
yeah, I didn't really think about that situation too much as far as influence goes, but that's really true. And you know what they say, like the winners write the history. Obviously, Christopher Columbus with the European um, power behind him, they're obviously the ones that are going to be writing the history books, saying that he was the hero of the day. And now in current times, we can look at like what actually happened, because we're far enough away from it where we can look at more objectively, and we could see that it wasn't as glorified and as heroic as we once thought.
Yeah, I could see that, and I think one of the greatest parts about looking at these great influencers is that they've come from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, we've always had athletes around that have influenced a lot of people, but you can also look, I mean, in the science background, you can always look at, physicists like Isaac Newton.
No, it goes on
Uh,
forever.
yeah, right. I mean,
Like
you
for
can look at Michelangelo. I mean,
yeah,
as a painter, I mean, if you look up in the Sistine Chapel, and it absolutely blows your mind that someone would work their entire life just to put this beautiful piece of artwork up for people to just gaze at. And it's incredible what people really go through to try to spread their life's work, and how much it does truly influence people later on. I mean, they say, I mean, you might die, but your passion, your work can live on forever. I mean, you can look at all sorts of people. I mean, Mozart, his music everyone knows about. I mean, anything like that, mathematicians, writers,
it's in every field. Um,
for sure.
One of my favorite would have to be Jackie Robinson, being the first African American professional baseball player, and he went against everything we thought. Um, well, not we, but everything the people thought during that time, and he received an immense amount of controversy, and he had hecklers at every single game, and for the I guess for a time he might have thought it was a mistake, the passion that he was pursuing. I don't know if it ever got to him to that point where he was regretting his decision, maybe, but it must not have been easy for him. But now, if we look
So
today, sorry, go on.
So I guess it's really interesting, which actually sort of goes against the some of the point that you have to be first. I guess a lot of people don't know this, but Jackie Robinson actually was not the first African American major leaguer. It actually his name was Mose Fleetwood Walker. Um, and the reason Jackie got so much fame is because he really Mose was a great player. But Jackie stood. He was really the person who paved the way. He stood against all the oppression that he did receive, and he just wanted to play ball. It was, I mean, he wasn't first, but he took what everyone threw at him, and he paved the way for African Americans, especially in sports. And you can really look at him as a lot of people think he's the first, but he really wasn't. And it's really interesting because you know although everyone looks towards one specific person, you see that there's, even though there might be people before them, they could still make a huge influence just by, stepping on the barriers.
Yeah. And I didn't even know about that other baseball player. I guess um, history gets kind of altered if you're not looking in the right places all the time. But um, yeah, I get like you said, I guess you don't always have to be the first, but some people will have a bigger impact just because, you know, the place and a time for everything. So I guess a way to wrap up this part of the podcast is if you want to just talk about people who have influenced you in your life, whether that's a relative, family member, or a public figure, a religious figure, anything along the lines, and it doesn't even have to be a person. Like you said, weather can influence. So, what are your thoughts?
Being from Buffalo, I think I can touch on that. Buffalo is, obviously known for our terrible sports teams, uh, our great food that makes us all fat.
Yeah.
But Buffalo overall is just a big family of great neighbors. Growing up, I always had my neighbors. We were always very close. Almost every day we'd be walking through each other's yards, talking with each other. All of our dogs would come and play together, and it's really sometimes the most important part for some people is who you grow up with. It doesn't even have to be your parents, sometimes your best friends, but
Yeah.
my biggest upbringing, what made me as a person is how I was treated in our small little neighborhood. um we always got along together. We'd always help each other out, whether it be shovel each other's driveways when something's going on. We'd always go to each other's sports games, support each other in any way that we could. We'd always spend our any Christmas holidays together. I mean, it's always important that you have a surrounding cast that can really influence you in the right way.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so you would say you're a product of your environment, kind of? Like you feel like your
I
environment has shaped you somewhat into the person you are today?
I think environment is a big
Broad term.
causation of, yeah. I mean, it's the right term for sure. What's nice about now, with how much we're able to use the internet, rather than other generations, is we're able to see a lot more diversity. Whereas Buffalo is, you know not where I grew up is 99% white, 1% every other race. And it's interesting. It's really eye opening being able to talk to so many different people that come from so many different backgrounds, and see why their environment has shaped them the way they have.
Yeah,
But it's nice because with the introduction of the internet to so many people's lives, we really learn to see things in an open our eyes a little bit, not like what we had before, where if you never saw them, you never cared.
that's really true. Um, I think the age that we live in now enables us to travel to anywhere we want to. With just a simple phone call, we can connect to any country at any time. You know, like even right now, I feel like the conversation we're having right now, you being in Buffalo, New York, and me being in Tallahassee, that's we've been able to do that due to technology. That's definitely been an influence on my life um, through many different ways. Is there any final comments or anything you'd like to say regarding influence or any influential people that you'd like to mention?
It's an important thing is that, sometimes you don't need to look for much older people to be influenced by. A lot of your friends are big influences. Sometimes, maybe your younger brother can be an influencer. I mean, even your dog, your pets can be influencers as well. Uh,
That's true, yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. Sometimes you don't need to talk to be influenced, and I think sometimes some of the best influencers are, you know, even animals. Things that will love you unconditionally for as long as you feed them, take them on a couple walks, and you know,
Yeah,
play with them sometimes.
definitely, yeah. Yeah, I feel like that will influence you in the means of your personal happiness and possibly even decision making, which is interesting because it's just like, you could say it's just an animal, you could say whatever you want, but when you have an animal or a pet in your life, that can honestly change your life in many different ways that you wouldn't even expect. So, all right. Would you like to wrap up the podcast? Any final statements?
I can leave that to you.
All right. That sounds good to me. Um, well, thank you for joining me on this podcast today. It's been fun talking to you. It'll be fun talking to you after the podcast as well. But no, honestly though, thank you so much for helping me with this, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the podcast. But for now, that is all. Tune in next week to listen to our next podcast. We'll be doing this every week. Um, so yeah, look out for that. Subscribe to the
Nice
YouTube
to
channel. All right, that's about it. Thank you again.